All right, I'm here with Bennett Pope, and we're going to be talking about Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, the text that we all studied in community group this past week. We have a couple things that we want to talk about, themes that came up from discussions throughout the week. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and read the text, and then we'll get into it. Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, the prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. So the wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. The word of the Lord. All right, before we get into it, I don't know if I told you this, Bennett, but back in September of this last year, so 4 months ago, Esther Meyer and I were talking about what are we going to do next after our first season of community groups over. We're doing a video curriculum with John Mark Comer, and we have people from all different places of faith, degrees of faith, experience with the Bible, and the thing that we both landed on is like, let's do a text. We want to do a Bible study, but let's do something that people are less familiar with.
Sure.
And so for me, I'm like, let's do the prophets. No one studies the prophets, but it's such, oh man, not that anybody can't read the prophets and the Holy Spirit can work through it, but it is a particular type of literary genre, right?
Yeah.
And so we talked about a lot of different options in that. And then we landed with Habakkuk, because Habakkuk is a distinctly different type of prophetic work. Because what maybe we're used to, like the Isaiah or Jeremiah, where thus saith the Lord, and there's judgment and promise and the prophet speaking to the people. Habakkuk is different because it's Habakkuk speaking just to God.
It is.
It's a conversation between God and Habakkuk. And so like that feels maybe more approachable if for someone who's never read prophetic literature. So really, as we're thinking through our community in this season, it almost landed on a pragmatic decision of like, hey, it gets us into some of the themes that we think are good for our community to wrestle with, but really it kind of ticks all the boxes that we're hoping for. Well, fast forward to the last few weeks and what's been happening in our country and then culminating with what's happening in our own state. There was a lot to talk about this week as we got into this. There's a lot
to talk about.
And even as I'm reading it, I'm like, man, there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, and I think it's curious to me because it's a conversation between Habakkuk and God. Yes, it's more approachable. Yes, it deals with questions that I think we're asking or maybe some of us are wrestling with now. But then I think it also, as a prophetic book, I wonder, is it a little bit outside the scope of prophetic literature? I think we often think about the prophetic as like telling the future, but really this leads us into the heart of, I think, what the prophetic is, as someone who represents the people to God and who represents God to the people. And so I think, yeah, we can also see ourselves in Habakkuk and find ourselves challenged by the book.
Totally. And I think one of the things that, I grew up thinking prophetic, the prophets are just people who tell the future. Yeah. And these are all just like divine forecasts. It's all just foreshadow. But as I've grown in my understanding, the prophetic is just God pulling back the curtain. And for the prophet saying, I want you to see the world in the way that I see it. In part, I want you to see this particular situation, what's happening from my point of view. And I want you to take that to the people. And then on behalf of the people say, like, hey, here's what we're wrestling with. Do you see what we're dealing with?
Yeah, have you forgotten us?
Have you forgotten us? And so the prophet is this in between where he's seeing things, and there's women who prophesy in the Old Testament. The prophet is the person who sees things in the particular way that God does and represents that conversation in both directions. And so I want to start with Habakkuk as the prophet and just the question of placement. It's an ambiguous beginning.
It is.
There's no, like, in the time of King Ahaz, there's no historical cues that set Habakkuk in a particular place. So as you've been in your guys' discussion from your study, what do you do with this ambiguous beginning of context for Habakkuk?
Yeah, I mean, I think it raises some questions. There are certainly some context clues, right? Habakkuk comes out swinging with kind of these accusations of violence and injustice around him, but that ultimately is not that helpful because throughout the history of Israel and Judah, there's all sorts of injustice. Eventually, next week, we get to hear more about the Babylonian Empire, which gives some context clues. But if we're not even thinking historically, and we're kind of historically in a timeline, Habakkuk lands, we see him clearly in the middle of significant injustice around him, and he's crying out to God. We see that pretty quickly. How long, O Lord, must I call for help? So yeah, we see kind of some of the context pretty quickly out of which Habakkuk is crying out.
And I think a lot of us, and this is a tension I feel a lot, is I want to know exactly what the violence is, what the context of it is, who are the good guys in this, who are the bad guys, whose team is he on, so that I can start putting frame of references on what's right, what's wrong. Because it's easier to digest and contextualize, of like, say, this is where I enter into the story, this is how I relate to it. Absent of that, Habakkuk is a historical figure. He is speaking of something in particular, violence to particular people, but I have to reckon with the broad brush nature of this and say, man, this could be any time in any place.
Yeah. Yeah, and like this could be any time in any place. It struck me as you were saying, like, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. It's not even apparent if Habakkuk considers God one of the good guys.
That's true, yeah.
That's a serious that's a serious question.
And I think this is a spoiler alert, it's just context. All 4 chapters of Habakkuk, or all 3 chapters of Habakkuk, are just between Habakkuk and God.
Yeah.
There's no other voices. So this is like this is like, feels like a fly on the wall conversation. And it's interesting how just the beginning here, like you were saying, Habakkuk comes out swinging. And so what that tells me already is that what we're dealing with is high tension, high dissonance, both in the social context, but also the spiritual context. There's high dissonance, high conflict. And you said this before we started recording, this is a lament. And you see this a lot in the Psalms. You see this all throughout, a lot through prophetic literature, of this sense of, God, I don't know if you know this, but it shouldn't be this way.
Yeah, there was a great kind of definition of lament given in one of the commentaries I was reading, I think maybe by Stanley Hauerwas, and I might not get this exactly right, but that like lament is drawing God's attention to injustice, essentially. It's calling on God and saying, God, do you see this wrong that's happening? We know that you're just, we know that you're good, so why aren't you stopping this? Which is a feeling that I'm familiar with myself, but also, like, I don't think that we talk about that as much. It's a biblical theme, and it's a biblical theme that we, especially in kind of the church in America, haven't necessarily addressed as much as Scripture does.
Yeah, that's it. It's a helpful definition of lament, because I think a lot of times when I hear people talk about lament, it's an acknowledgement of sadness. Like, we're sad, and so we're going to lament. over like in grief, and that's part of it. But I think it's in the broader sense. The world is not...
So recognition the world is not as it should be.
Right. And not just, I'm sad, can you help me not be sad anymore? I think the other thing that is interesting about this, and just the context and the placement of like what these first 4 verses do for us, is God's in the hot seat here.
Yeah, I like that.
And I don't necessarily see Habakkuk like wagging his finger at God, but he is demanding that God reckon for what's happening. It's, yeah, if we had an insecure God, a book like Habakkuk wouldn't be here.
Say that again. Say that
Right?
again.
Because if God was like, hey, you can't talk to me that way, then Habakkuk, we don't have this book. God introduces this whole relationship, not with his voice, but with Habakkuk's anger and with his lament. And that's the first words we hear from Habakkuk. And if God doesn't want us to speak to him, these are deep, honest, raw observations and feelings. And if he doesn't want us to speak like that to him, then we don't have Habakkuk. And so when I come into Habakkuk and I hear this, and it starts like this, I don't know exactly what violence, what time period, who the good guys or bad guys are, but this is God saying, I want you, readers, to know how to interact with me when you don't like what's happening.
Yeah. That's so good. And I think depending on translations too, we're reading out of the NIV right now, but it's possible that kind of like the questions in verse 2 are actually just statements. Like the intro is, how long, O Lord? ? I call for help, but you do not listen. I cry out to you, violence, but you do not save. That those are statements, in like he's essentially accusing God, just going after him. In which case, like that kind of indictment against God almost just even strengthens, beyond what it already is. And there's so much, I think, emotion in the words like violence. How do you tolerate the wrongdoing? Destruction, violence are before me, strife, conflict. Yeah, there's just a lot of strong language.
Yeah, and he's very clear about it. He's not beating around the bush, alluding. When I was reading this in preparation for all this, it was, man, such a visceral, feelings. This isn't flowery language. This isn't poetic. This is, I need an answer.
Yeah.
I've had enough of this.
Yeah. So like, how does that compare, Evan, with how you do have interacted with God? Like, does this challenge you? Does it comfort you? How does that, how does Habakkuk influence to speak into the way that you speak to God?
I'm trying not to jump ahead because I know what Habakkuk says in the end of chapter 1. But this is a level of commitment to the relationship that feels stubborn, but has such high expectation for God to keep his promises.
Right.
I mean, there's times, man, and we're going to get into this, but there's times where I'm like, this has been happening for so long that it's not even worth talking to God about.
Yeah.
I've felt this way. I don't even think God cares. And so I'm just going to move on. I'll just figure this one out, and I'll talk to God and let God deal with other parts of my life. Habakkuk is like, no. I mean, everything he says is because there's an expectation that God is the resolution of these things.
Right. Yeah, there's this confidence, and it kind of goes unsaid, but it actually, like, without it, this text doesn't make any sense. That, you know, when he says, how long must I call for help and you do not listen? There's this expectation that says, like, God, based on who I know you to be, I know that you listen. I know that you save. I know that you cannot tolerate wrongdoing and injustice. I know that you do not care for the destruction and violence. And I know that you are heartbroken about this, more heartbroken than I even am. And so if I feel like this way about what's happening, if this is how gutted I am, how have you not acted? Because that doesn't make sense given who I know you to be.
Yeah. Well, or I've heard stories. So you think Exodus chapter 2, when God tells Moses, I have heard the cries and the anguish, and essentially God's like, I must act. He's compelled by what he has heard his people crying out. And so Habakkuk is here is like, I know you do this, but it seems and it feels like you're not doing what you have done. That's a dissonance, and I'm not okay just walking away from this. And so I think that even in this, when I think about what this stirs in me, what I see in Habakkuk, this isn't an accusation of I'm set out. Habakkuk's not set out to prove God wrong. He's planted himself to let God speak for himself. And it's almost like Habakkuk's like going back to the role of the prophet, like, show me what it is that you're seeing here. I need to know. I need to know that you know. If there's been one instance in my life where I felt that way, there's been 1,000.
Yeah. Yeah, and what an invitation and a challenge. Like, how often are we asking God that question of God, what are you seeing here? Like both just in the day-to-day of walking around and seeing faces that we don't always give a second thought to, but the more so when we look on injustice and wonder where God could be in the midst of it.
So this was the other thing that came up from discussions I heard from community group leaders. You and I talked about this, of how do we talk about and make that move? Because this could have been, there are currently people saying this, move the conversation to present day. We read this, and I think everybody who's reading this right now or listening to this would have to actively work not to try to contextualize this to what's happening in our state right now. And maybe if we're not even thinking about what's happening in our state, there's so many different places, nationally, locally, relationally, where we feel this violence or we're seeing violence. How do we, and this isn't going to stop.
No.
In the book of Habakkuk. This paints the picture. This is the direction of the conversation of Habakkuk. So as we move forward with this, how do we talk about, is there a line between, no, we want to just have textual conversations versus contextualizing and bringing this in? Because as much as people have a hard time sometimes talking about faith in God, contextualizing with the climate that we're living in is also hard. So let's put both of those together. Yeah.
I love that you're just, you're posing the question and then you're teeing me up for the answers that I don't know if anyone's going to receive. But it's a huge question. And especially I think in these first verses, we look at words like justice, which I think in the church has, and just in our society as a whole, is just a complex word, because in so many ways it has just these political connotations to it.
And because the question is whose definition?
Right.
If we're talking about justice, now we're talking about policy. Are we talking about partisan? Are we talking about, so there is with
Yeah, and I mean, you've raised the kind of questions, you've raised what is happening in our state right now, in the Twin Cities, and even here in Duluth. Yeah, there are questions around definitions around what is injustice, destruction, and violence that is being kind of done from all sides of the political aisle. And yeah, it raises questions about, like, I mean, how do we actually, as Christians, think about justice, about law enforcement, about, I mean, like, the questions abound. And I think the thing that is challenging for me is so often we take our political identities and we apply that to our faith. And so we sit down for a conversation about justice and we automatically put ourselves kind of across the aisle from somebody else. And so, like, my question is, can we, like, as people gathering from different backgrounds, like, can we actually put our identity in Christ first and look at one another and say, like, I'm committed to you. Like, we might have some different ideas, but, like, I'm committed to pursuing Jesus alongside you. And, that bond, that commitment means more to me than our disagreements about kind of like how we define or talk about justice.
Right.
And can we actually, like, see the other and walk alongside them as we kind of try and figure out how to actually apply this?
Yeah. I'm really glad that you made the point that a lot of times we bring, and I won't even say our political views, but we bring our worldviews to Scripture and say, through my worldview, I'm going to try to solve this. What's interesting, and I think is really important to note as we go through Habakkuk, and we see it, and this is where the ambiguity of context in Habakkuk makes it so hard for us. Because this is a conversation about God's action based on who Habakkuk knows God to be. This isn't, hey, this is what we're doing, and these are the good people, and you should be taking care of us. It's broad, and Habakkuk's holding God to God's standard. And so I think the conversation when why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. What I want us to do is ask the question of, what does justice from God's perspective look like? What does wholeness, what is the resolution, what is the intention of life together, human flourishing, right relationship with God? What does that look like on God's terms? Like, what has He said throughout the Old Testament? What promises has He made?
Yeah, and, like, I mean, when we think about, like, obviously these, like, destruction, violence, injustice, Habakkuk is positing these things as, like, the opposite of what God's will is. And so what are the opposite of those things? Like, I think oftentimes we think about peace as just, like, the absence of violence, but, like, the biblical concept of peace or shalom is, like, this wholeness. Nothing is broken, nothing is missing. Like, everybody has what they need to flourish. And so, like, when we think about God's justice, we think about right relationships. Right relationships with, like, it's not just the kind of tolerant indifference, but that it's actually every person caring for one another and having like being invested in their flourishing and their holistic well-being. And so, yeah, like, when we think about the kingdom of heaven, like, what are those relationships? How are we pursuing that? And how are we, like Habakkuk, looking at the brokenness around us and crying out in lament to say, where are you in the midst of this? And maybe not just that, but also, like, where are you calling me to be in the midst of this?
And Habakkuk is talking to God about this. Right? Like, he's taking these feelings that, like, I've felt towards a lot of different people, a lot of different groups just over the last month. I mean, you could go to any particular group, person, and say, where are you? Why aren't you listening to the people? All this violence is before me. What are you going to do about it? You could take that to people, the people with power, the people on either side. Habakkuk's taking it to God. And it's not disassociated. He's not talking about this hypothetically of, like, I wonder what would happen if there was violence in the world. What would God have to say about it? He has particular people in mind. And so he's in these, just as in this tension of he has his feet on the ground and his eyes directed to the Father on the throne. And I think that that's just going to be the tension throughout the book. And to stick with the conversation and say, like, what is God going to say? How does he respond? What am I expecting from God? Like, am I expecting God, if I were to say these, am I expecting God to say, you're right, Evan, my bad, I will appease, I will do the things that you were hoping to do? Okay, so that's what I want, if I'm being honest. That's what I want. But am I willing to enter into this kind of conversation and let God speak for himself and then bend towards that? Or am I committed to my worldview and say, like, okay, let's see if God is on my team or not? And so I think as we go through Habakkuk, I love what you said about coming in with a commitment to the people in the room and to walking with the people in the room. And my hope would be that we can do that so that together we can have our worldviews bend towards who God is. I want my worldview and my political understandings, my relational, I mean, if there was no political strife, we could be talking about this in a relational context, right? Just friends, roommates, parents, this still works. And so, like, I want my agenda, like my desires, to be bent towards God's decision on what wholeness and justice and restoration look like. God, just pull back the curtain. Can you just give me a glimpse? And I think that that's the gift that we could get from a book like Habakkuk.
Yeah, it's the question of, like, there's challenging and maybe even uncomfortable material here, but can we remain committed enough to one another, and ultimately can we remain committed enough to God to stay at the table, to stay around the table in conversation as we pursue who God is and who he's calling us to be.
Yeah. Well, that feels, we've covered a lot.
Yeah.
Just a light first intro to this season of community groups. Next week, we get to hear God's response, and I'm excited to hear what God has to say. So, thank you, Bennett, for this.
Thank you.
And excited for what's in store for next week.